I never expected a single glance in the wrong mirror to unsettle everything I thought I knew about myself. That afternoon, sunlight slanted through the blinds and caught the edge of my sister's vanity mirror, painting the room in streaks of gold and shadow. I thought I was alone, thought I had the privacy I needed, but the soft squeak of the floorboards behind me betrayed that assumption before I even had time to turn. Her best friend, Lena, was there. Her wide eyes were fixed on me in disbelief, a silent question hanging between us that I wasn't prepared to answer. I froze, the sweater I'd borrowed from my sister still bunched awkwardly in my hands, and the skirt, something I'd chosen carefully, timidly, felt suddenly like a confession in fabric. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the air, but I couldn't. The truth of it all, the curiosity, the shame, the tentative thrill, was suddenly uncontainable, laid bare before someone I had imagined would never see this side of me. Lena didn't laugh. She didn't shout. She simply watched, and in that watching, I understood more about myself than I had in months of solitary reflection. I'd started exploring this side of myself quietly, in the small hours, when the house was empty and the world seemed more forgiving. At first, it was a form of escape, slipping into a different silhouette, feeling the texture of fabric against skin, tracing the outline of someone I wasn't supposed to be. But over time, it became something more, a lens through which I could examine myself with unflinching honesty. Yet that honesty had been private, safe, contained. Until now. Her presence was a mirror of its own kind. In her eyes, I glimpsed the question I'd been avoiding: who am I really, beneath the layers I show the world? And in that instant, the risk I had never considered, the moral, emotional, social consequences, came rushing in. Not fear of ridicule, exactly, but fear of misunderstanding, of betrayal. I knew I had crossed a threshold, I just didn't know if I'd be able to return. The room smelled faintly of her perfume and my sister's shampoo, a combination that made my pulse quicken for reasons I couldn't name. Lena shifted slightly, then said, softly, "I didn't know you felt like this." Her voice didn't carry judgment, only curiosity and a trace of something I couldn't quite name, something that might be compassion. And for the first time, I realized that part of growing, part of understanding oneself, was not simply hiding or indulging in secret, but facing the reflection, however uncomfortable, and letting it speak. I didn't respond immediately. Words felt inadequate to explain the swirl of emotions inside me: shame, relief, fear, and a faint, unexpected surge of hope. Hope that perhaps identity wasn't a prison but a dialogue, and that maybe someone else's understanding could be the bridge to my own. Time seemed to stretch, dense and sticky, like honey dripping slowly from the edges of reality. Lena stayed in the doorway, silent but present, and I felt each second amplifying every heartbeat in my chest. The room, the vanity, the scattered makeup brushes, the faint smell of her shampoo mingling with the faint detergent scent of my borrowed clothes, was suddenly both a sanctuary and a stage. I wanted to explain, to justify, but the words that might have seemed simple in my head tangled into knots the moment I tried to form them aloud. I remembered the first time I tried on my sister's clothes, months ago. It had started as a joke, a fleeting curiosity, an experiment in textures and colors. I hadn't anticipated the sensation of recognition, the way the fabric seemed to affirm a part of me I had kept locked away. That initial excitement had been coupled with immediate shame. I stuffed the clothes back into her drawer and told myself it would remain a private indulgence, a secret I'd never speak aloud. And yet here I was, caught in the act by someone who wasn't family but wasn't a stranger either, a person whose judgment mattered in ways I hadn't fully considered. Lena's presence wasn't accusatory. She didn't laugh or sneer. Instead, her eyes held something quiet, something almost imperceptible, a mix of surprise and cautious openness. I wanted to shrink, to disappear into the folds of the skirt I was still wearing, but her gaze anchored me. It demanded honesty, not the performative honesty I sometimes gave the world, but the kind that trembles and falters, that speaks only when forced by circumstance. I don't know what to say, I admitted, voice barely above a whisper. My words hung awkwardly, insufficient, inadequate. It was true, in a way that was both liberating and terrifying. I didn't know what to say, because I didn't fully understand myself yet. The act of dressing like this had always felt like a conversation with my own reflection, not with anyone else. I had been learning about myself in solitude, piecing together fragments of identity that never seemed to fit neatly into the categories life had assigned me. Lena stepped closer, but cautiously, as if approaching an animal that might bolt at the slightest gesture. "You don't have to explain everything to me," she said softly. Her tone carried neither judgment nor curiosity as a weapon, only as a bridge. "I just want to understand." The simplicity of that statement struck me with an almost physical force. Wanting to be understood, not to be validated, not to be praised, not to be fixed, but simply understood. That was a need I hadn't fully admitted, even to myself. And in that moment, I realized that the fear I had carried for months wasn't just about being seen, it was about being misinterpreted, reduced to a joke or a secret, a mere novelty for someone else's amusement. I glanced at my reflection in the mirror. The person staring back was familiar and strange at once, an amalgam of the identity I had always known and the one I was only beginning to explore. The soft fabric of the sweater, the skirt that swished lightly against my legs, the faint sheen of lip balm, I had chosen these things in solitude, carefully, tentatively, testing boundaries and building confidence in a way that was invisible to everyone else. And now, that invisible process was visible. I noticed the subtle tension in my shoulders, the way my hands fidgeted with the edge of the skirt, and I realized that my body, so long accustomed to hiding, had been betrayed by habit. I had become aware of myself in a new dimension, not just as the private experimenter, but as a participant in a social reality that could not be undone by retreating into my room. Lena didn't flinch at my hesitation. She simply waited. And that waiting felt like an education in empathy, the lesson that understanding isn't always active, it can be patient, silent, observant, giving space without pressure. I swallowed, trying to steady my voice. "It's not easy to explain," I said finally. "I've been figuring this out on my own, for months. I'm still figuring out what it means to me, who I am when I do this." Her expression softened. "Then maybe the first step is just letting yourself be who you are, without needing an explanation. Sometimes we need to be seen before we can even understand ourselves." I felt a warmth that wasn't entirely physical. It wasn't relief, exactly, it was something subtler, a cautious hope that perhaps the world could hold space for my uncertainty. For once, I didn't have to pretend I had everything figured out. The moral complexity of the moment, the risk of exposure, the vulnerability, the potential for misinterpretation, was still there, but it was tempered by a human connection I hadn't anticipated. We spoke in fragments then, quietly, carefully. I tried to articulate what it felt like to step outside the narrow expectations of my daily life, to explore a softer, more fluid version of myself in the private theater of my sister's room. I spoke of relief, of shame, of the strange exhilaration that came from seeing my reflection and feeling, for the first time, a resonance with what I knew deep down but had never allowed myself to acknowledge. Lena listened, and in her listening, I began to recognize that identity was not a solitary pursuit, it existed in relation to others, even if those others only witnessed small slices of it. Time passed unnoticed. The sunlight shifted across the room, and I realized hours could have gone by without my noticing. The world outside still existed, full of judgment, expectation, and routine, but inside that room, something unspoken had changed. I had been caught, yes, but I had also been seen, and that seeing carried a weight far greater than embarrassment, it carried possibility. When she finally spoke again, it was with a tentative laugh, almost nervous. "I promise I'm not going to tell anyone," she said. "But I think you should know, you don't have to hide this part of yourself, not with me. I want to see you, all of you, even the parts you're still figuring out." And in that moment, I understood the subtle power of moral accountability, not just to others, but to myself. The honesty I had practiced in solitude had led me here, to an unplanned confrontation, and the way I navigated it would shape my understanding of trust, empathy, and self-respect. I was no longer just exploring identity in isolation, I was negotiating it in the shared space of human relationships. And that was a lesson I couldn't have learned any other way. I don't remember how long we stayed like that, suspended in conversation and reflection. Eventually, Lena left, but the room felt different after she closed the door, charged with possibility and tension, a private arena in which I had confronted fear, shame, and hope all at once. I stood before the mirror, alone again, and looked at the reflection of a person simultaneously familiar and strange, private and social, cautious yet emboldened. The skirt and sweater were still there, but they no longer felt like secret armor. They were tools for exploration, yes, but also symbols of a truth I was learning to inhabit carefully, thoughtfully, ethically. And for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future in which the act of being seen wasn't a threat, but a bridge between private understanding and shared human connection, a path toward empathy, honesty, and self-awareness I hadn't yet fully traversed. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog I couldn't shake. Lena hadn't said anything beyond her quiet promise, and yet her presence lingered in every corner of the house. I could feel it in the air, in the way the sunlight hit the walls, in the faint echo of her voice when I replayed our conversation in my mind. I wanted to return to my routine, to reclaim the comfort of normalcy, but the encounter had cracked something open. It wasn't simply a matter of being discovered, it was that discovery had forced me to see myself differently, to confront layers of identity and desire I had only ever acknowledged in the privacy of my room. I began noticing my own behavior in ways I hadn't before. The way I adjusted my posture when walking past mirrors, the small hesitations before choosing clothing in the morning, even the way I moved my hands as if anticipating judgment. Every action seemed loaded with hidden meaning, and I realized that living in a body that carried both secrecy and aspiration was an exercise in constant self-monitoring. The emotional weight of concealment was subtle, but relentless. I felt it pressing in during quiet moments at the kitchen table, at school, in the spaces where my sister's absence was most acute. One evening, I found myself back in her room, drawn not by a desire for the clothes themselves, but by the need to inhabit the space where I had first been truly seen. I ran my fingers over the soft fabric of a sweater I had always loved, but never dared to wear outside of solitude. The texture reminded me of Lena's words, "You don't have to hide this part of yourself." I repeated them silently, as if chanting a mantra, and wondered how much courage it would take to live honestly, even when honesty carried risk. It wasn't just about fear of exposure. It was about responsibility to myself and to others. I had begun to understand that the self I was exploring did not exist in a vacuum. Choices had consequences. Being authentic meant more than private satisfaction, it meant considering how my actions intersected with the lives of people who might not understand, and learning to navigate those intersections with care. I thought of my sister, of Lena, of the countless interactions that might become charged if I misjudged timing or trust. I realized identity wasn't simply about self-expression, it was a social contract, delicate and complex. At school, everything seemed amplified. I noticed the subtleties of how people presented themselves, the tiny cues of approval and discomfort, the invisible rules that governed behavior. I began to see parallels in my own life, the careful calculations, the avoidance of eye contact, the rehearsed gestures I performed to blend into expectation. In private, I could explore freely, in public, I was negotiating not just perception but morality, how to remain true to myself without unintentionally causing harm or misunderstanding. Lena's influence lingered. She had shown me that empathy could be as potent as exposure. I replayed our conversation countless times, noticing nuances I had missed before, the tilt of her head, the softness in her voice, the absence of judgment. It was a lesson in moral courage as much as identity, to witness without condemning, to hold space without assuming, to allow someone else's humanity to exist fully even when it defies comfort or expectation. I realized that the act of being seen was not a surrender but a dialogue, and in that dialogue, accountability became a guiding principle. One night, I stayed awake for hours, notebook in hand, trying to articulate the feelings I could not yet name. I wrote about shame and liberation, about risk and safety, about secrecy and trust. I wrote about the subtle exhilaration of inhabiting a form that felt right, even when I could not yet define what right meant. I wrote about responsibility, not the kind imposed by external authority, but the internal kind, the ethics of being oneself in relation to others. In those pages, I confronted the paradox that had been growing inside me, that authenticity carried both freedom and weight, and that true understanding required patience, reflection, and courage. Gradually, I began experimenting with subtle expressions in public. Not full crossdressing, not yet, but small gestures, a scarf that felt more like me, a sweater in colors that resonated, a posture that carried confidence instead of concealment. Each choice was a measured risk, a test of boundaries, and each success felt like a quiet victory. It was never about spectacle, it was about integrity, about aligning the private self with the public world in ways that honored both. At home, I noticed changes in my relationships. My sister remained unaware, but our interactions carried new undercurrents, unspoken shifts in familiarity and comfort. With Lena, I found myself speaking more openly, tentatively probing her empathy, learning how to negotiate trust. Every conversation became a practice in honesty and reflection. I began to understand that identity was not static, it evolved in response to experience, to observation, to human connection. I also wrestled with doubt. There were nights when I questioned whether the exploration was self-indulgence, whether the risk of exposure was worth the private fulfillment. I worried about misunderstanding, ridicule, rejection. I feared that even empathy could be fragile, that trust might crumble under the weight of social expectation. And yet, even in those moments of anxiety, I recognized a subtle truth, that moral reflection, internal dialogue, and conscious choice were themselves transformative. I was learning not just about gender expression, but about responsibility, courage, and the quiet, persistent labor of living honestly. One afternoon, Lena appeared at the doorway unexpectedly, smiling but cautious. She didn't comment on my clothing or posture, she simply asked, "How are you?" And I realized the depth of the lesson she had given me, that being seen, being understood, is less about explanation and more about presence. We spent hours talking, not about clothing, not about identity labels, but about experience, reflection, choices, and consequences. It was one of the first times I felt the full weight of dialogue as an ethical act. To be open was not merely confession, it was a mutual negotiation of trust, empathy, and understanding. By the end of that conversation, I felt something shift inside me. The act of being observed had moved from threat to opportunity. The initial fear, the tension, the moral anxiety, all of it had transformed into a kind of reflective courage. I understood that identity is a continuous dialogue, not a fixed state. That crossdressing, for me, was not a costume but a lens, a way to explore, understand, and inhabit complexity with honesty, care, and accountability. And as I stood alone later, looking in the mirror once more, I saw not just a reflection of fabric and form, but of moral consciousness taking shape. The person staring back at me was the same yet profoundly different, more aware, more attentive, more responsible. I understood that transformation was never simply external, it was a gradual alignment of thought, emotion, and action, a process that required patience, reflection, and ethical courage. The weeks that followed felt like living in a slow, expanding shadow. Every encounter, every glance, every casual comment began to carry weight I hadn't anticipated. I became hyper-aware of the texture of my own presence, as if the world could sense every hesitation, every uncertainty, every carefully concealed piece of my identity. Lena's quiet acceptance had not removed the tension, it had sharpened it in subtle ways. I realized that being seen, even by someone who offered understanding, was not the end of struggle but the beginning of a new form of vigilance, one rooted in reflection rather than fear. At school, I found myself navigating a delicate balance between self-expression and invisibility. I experimented in tiny increments, a scarf draped in a certain way, a sweater that suggested softness without inviting comment, my posture adjusted in subtle ways that shifted the rhythm of my presence. These small acts were exercises in courage, but also in accountability. I became acutely conscious that every choice I made existed in relation to others, and that the ethics of self-expression were inseparable from empathy. I did not seek attention, I sought alignment between my inner self and my outer world, and in doing so, I discovered that integrity is both quiet and relentless. Home life became a new kind of laboratory. I found myself lingering longer in my sister's room, not simply to wear her clothes, but to inhabit the environment of reflection and understanding that had been forged in that first encounter with Lena. Each evening, I rehearsed small gestures in the mirror, not performance for others, but preparation for the ongoing negotiation between privacy and presence. It was exhausting in a way I hadn't anticipated. There was a constant oscillation between exhilaration and apprehension, a rhythm of desire and responsibility that demanded attention and care. The moral dimension of being seen became increasingly present. I realized that identity is never isolated, it exists in the context of relationships, social norms, and expectations. I began asking myself questions I had avoided before. How does this exploration affect those around me? How do I carry the truth of myself without imposing fear, misunderstanding, or discomfort on others? What is the boundary between honesty and indiscretion, between vulnerability and responsibility? These questions were not theoretical, they were lived, immediate, and relentless. Each choice was a negotiation, and each negotiation was a lesson in ethical awareness. Lena remained a quiet anchor in this process. She did not direct or instruct, she observed, asked, and reflected. Her presence reminded me that empathy can be active without dominating, that moral courage is often measured by patience and understanding rather than by pronouncement. I began to see my own attempts to hide and control exposure in a new light. Secrecy had felt protective, but it had also limited my ability to grow. Trust, I realized, required both vulnerability and accountability. It was not enough to explore privately, I had to consider the ripples my honesty created in the social world. One evening, my sister returned unexpectedly, her presence casual and unaware, and I froze in the midst of subtle self-adjustment. The tension was immediate, visceral. My reflection in the mirror became both a friend and a threat, a mirror of identity and a mirror of consequence. I realized that my journey was not just about self-perception but about relational awareness. The act of being authentic carried social weight, and navigating that weight demanded patience, strategy, and moral reflection. I learned that self-expression without consideration of context is not courage, but recklessness. The ethics of visibility require deliberate thought. I also became aware of my own assumptions. I had expected fear or judgment. Instead, I discovered curiosity, hesitation, and tentative empathy from those who observed the edges of my transformation. This shifted something internally. I realized that identity is relational, co-created through the perceptions and reactions of others. Being seen does not only expose vulnerability, it also invites dialogue, understanding, and connection. I began to notice the subtleties of response, the way people's eyes lingered, the pauses in speech, the shifts in tone and posture, and I recognized these as data points in an ongoing negotiation of presence and authenticity. Internally, I wrestled with the tension between freedom and restraint. Each choice carried potential for clarity and misinterpretation, for acceptance and rejection. I reflected on moral responsibility, the idea that being true to oneself is inseparable from care for others. It was not enough to feel aligned with my own identity, I had to ensure that my alignment did not unintentionally harm or mislead. Every small act of crossdressing became a microcosm of ethical decision-making, a negotiation between self, observer, and society. There were moments of near panic. One afternoon, I walked past a group of peers who cast subtle glances, and I felt the old familiar pull of fear, shame, and self-doubt. Yet in the same moment, I remembered Lena's words, the gentle affirmation in her eyes, that being seen is not surrender but dialogue. I held myself steady, breathing through the discomfort, acknowledging the fear without letting it dictate my presence. This was the work of transformation, the cultivation of inner resilience, ethical awareness, and reflective courage. At home, I experimented with small rituals of reflection. I journaled extensively, tracing patterns of thought and feeling, noting instances of fear, courage, and moral questioning. I began writing letters I never sent, dialogues I never spoke aloud, attempting to articulate the intersection of desire, identity, and responsibility. The process was painstaking, often exhausting, but it clarified a central truth: authenticity is not a single moment of revelation but a continual process of engagement, negotiation, and reflection. Through these practices, I began to see myself in a broader ethical framework. I understood that transformation is relational, continuous, and multidimensional. My crossdressing was no longer simply a private exploration, it was a lived inquiry into identity, empathy, and moral responsibility. Each choice became an act of reflection, each exposure a test of integrity. I began to comprehend that courage is not simply the act of being seen, it is the willingness to engage with the consequences of that visibility thoughtfully and ethically. By the end of those weeks, I noticed subtle shifts in my own awareness. I moved with more deliberate care, spoke with more intentionality, and considered the ethical implications of my presence in ways that had previously escaped me. The act of crossdressing had begun as an exploration of self-perception. It had evolved into a comprehensive lesson in moral consciousness, social awareness, and emotional resilience. I realized that identity is inseparable from reflection, accountability, and dialogue, a continuous negotiation between inner truth and social context. And yet, despite the growing complexity, there was a quiet satisfaction in this ongoing work. I had discovered a form of courage that was neither performative nor reckless, the courage to explore privately, to navigate socially, to act ethically, and to reflect continuously. I had begun to inhabit a space of authenticity that honored both my inner truth and the humanity of those around me. And in that balance, I recognized a profound, subtle transformation, one that was not complete, perhaps never will be, but which carried depth, integrity, and the possibility of understanding. The months that followed felt like moving through a world that was both familiar and entirely new. Each day was a negotiation, each encounter a subtle test of courage, empathy, and self-awareness. I realized that transformation is not a single moment or revelation, it is a prolonged, intricate process, a layering of awareness over months, years, a continual dialogue between who I am privately and who I choose to present publicly. Every time I put on a sweater or adjusted a scarf, every time I stood a little taller, walked a little differently, or allowed my hands to rest more naturally at my sides, I was practicing a form of ethical courage I had never anticipated. I became acutely aware of the way the world interprets bodies and appearances. Small gestures carried disproportionate meaning, and subtle changes could shift perception in ways I could neither fully control nor predict. It was exhausting at first, to be conscious of every micro-expression, every footstep, every angle of gaze. But gradually, I began to see these challenges not as obstacles but as opportunities for reflection. I learned to observe myself not as a performance, but as a participant in a social dialogue that required patience, nuance, and integrity. Lena remained my anchor, though our interactions had become rarer as her own life pressed forward. When we did speak, however, the conversations carried more depth than ever. She asked questions not to satisfy curiosity, but to provoke thought. "How do you decide what parts of yourself to show?" she asked one afternoon, eyes calm but probing. "And how do you live with what you choose not to?" I didn't answer immediately. Her questions unsettled me, but in the discomfort, I found clarity. I realized that crossdressing, for me, had never been about simply presenting a different image, it was about understanding the interplay between private truth and public perception, about grappling with the ethical responsibility of being seen while not compromising the well-being of others. My answer emerged slowly, each word a careful step across the tightrope of honesty and moral reflection. "I try to make choices that feel true," I said finally, "but also choices that I can live with, choices that acknowledge the impact on others, and that don't take their understanding for granted." It was the first time I articulated a principle that had been gestating inside me for months: authenticity is inseparable from accountability. Every act of self-expression exists in a web of relationships, and ethical courage is the willingness to navigate that web consciously. I began to see my clothing not simply as fabric but as a tool for negotiation, a medium through which I could practice integrity, reflection, and empathy. At home, my relationship with my sister remained unchanged on the surface, but beneath the quiet routine, I felt subtle shifts. I became more attentive, more aware of the ways I occupied space, the rhythm of conversation, the flow of attention. I realized that transformation is not only internal, it has tangible effects on those around us. My presence in the world, my choices, my moments of visibility or concealment, all ripple outward. I had to learn to move with mindfulness, balancing the desire to explore myself with the responsibility to honor the perceptions and emotions of others. School, too, became a classroom in subtle ethics. I noticed the patterns of judgment, the microaggressions, the fleeting moments of empathy. I observed how peers navigated identity, sometimes clumsily, sometimes gracefully. I learned to read cues carefully, to respond with patience and integrity, and to recognize the humanity in everyone's uncertainty. I began small experiments in authenticity, tiny expressions that hinted at my identity without demanding attention, choices that allowed me to practice courage, reflection, and ethical awareness simultaneously. One evening, Lena and I sat in her living room, the late light falling across her desk as we talked quietly. She asked me about fear, about the persistent anxiety that sometimes overwhelmed me. "How do you live with it?" she said softly. I thought for a long moment, tracing my own experiences in memory, the first moment she had seen me, the countless nights of reflection, the subtle, careful steps I had taken in public and at home. "I don't," I admitted. "Not completely. But I live with it differently now. I acknowledge it, I analyze it, and I try to let it guide me rather than control me. Fear is a compass, I just have to learn to read it correctly." She nodded, and I realized that her empathy was not simply comfort, it was education. She was teaching me to integrate my private truth with public awareness, to recognize fear not as a limitation but as a signal, a moral and emotional guidepost. In that quiet room, I began to understand that courage is never about absence of fear, it is about measured engagement with risk, awareness of consequence, and reflection on impact. Over time, I began to explore the physical world more openly, carefully, ethically. I experimented with clothing choices in public spaces, always attuned to both my comfort and the reactions of others. It was not performative, it was a practice in honesty and relational mindfulness. I learned that visibility carries responsibility, the responsibility to embody integrity, to navigate perception with care, and to reflect on the consequences of every act. The process was not linear. Some days were effortless, moments of quiet confidence, other days were riddled with doubt, anxiety, and moral reflection. Each encounter, each glance, each hesitation became a microcosm of the broader struggle: how to be oneself while maintaining ethical awareness, how to balance desire with responsibility, how to cultivate courage without disregard for social context. And in these months, a subtle transformation took hold, one that went beyond clothing, posture, or external perception. I began to inhabit my own mind differently. I reflected on the way I had previously hidden, the ways I had avoided dialogue, the ethical compromises I had made in pursuit of secrecy. I recognized that transformation is as much about moral consciousness as it is about self-expression, that identity, integrity, empathy, and responsibility are inseparable threads in the tapestry of a human life. By the end of the period, I had learned to act with intentionality. Each choice, whether in private or public, was weighed for both authenticity and impact. I had developed a deeper empathy for those whose internal struggles remain unseen, a respect for the complexity of human identity, and a commitment to ethical engagement in every interaction. My reflection in the mirror became less about concealment or revelation and more about alignment, the alignment of thought, emotion, desire, and responsibility. And in that alignment, I discovered a profound truth: that transformation is never a final state. It is an ongoing journey, a continual negotiation between private truth and social reality, a process that demands courage, reflection, empathy, and accountability at every step. It is quiet, deliberate, and deeply human, a journey toward understanding oneself and others, toward inhabiting the world ethically while remaining true to the self. The morning sun fell in thin, precise streaks across my bedroom floor, illuminating dust motes like tiny, suspended secrets. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of months pressed quietly into my chest, the cumulative tension, the careful navigation, the unspoken reflections that had become almost tangible, as if my thoughts themselves occupied the space around me. I realized that transformation was no longer an isolated act of private experimentation. It had expanded, stretching into every corner of my life, every small decision, every glance, every interaction. I had moved from secrecy to careful disclosure, from fear to reflection, from impulsive exploration to deliberate, ethical engagement. It was Lena's influence that had anchored me, that had taught me patience and empathy and the courage to inhabit my own complexity. Yet I had come to understand that her guidance was only a mirror, reflecting what I already possessed, but had been too hesitant to recognize: a capacity for accountability, for ethical awareness, for deliberate self-expression. In every encounter with her, I had confronted my own assumptions, my own fears, and my own moral boundaries. I had learned that being authentic is inseparable from responsibility, and that courage is measured not only by visibility but by reflection on impact. I remembered the first time she caught me in my sister's clothes, the shock, the tension, the silence. I remembered the cascade of emotions: shame, relief, exhilaration, fear, hope. That moment had seemed catastrophic at first, but in retrospect, it had been the opening act of a transformation far deeper than mere appearance. It had forced me to confront the moral and social dimensions of being seen, to wrestle with trust, to acknowledge the ethical weight of vulnerability. Over time, the reflection in the mirror had shifted from a fragile, hesitant presence to a grounded awareness of self. I no longer needed the borrowed fabrics as armor. They were tools of exploration, yes, but more importantly, symbols of the ongoing process of aligning inner truth with external action. I had learned to inhabit my own body and mind with intentionality, to move deliberately in spaces charged with expectation, and to negotiate relationships with care, empathy, and honesty. Every subtle gesture, every choice of clothing, every expression of posture was a practice in ethical engagement, a microcosm of the broader negotiation between self, society, and conscience. Home had become a laboratory of reflection and experimentation. I had begun to notice the rhythms of family, the spaces where authenticity could coexist with consideration for others, the ways in which my presence could both comfort and unsettle. I had learned that identity is relational, that trust is earned through careful negotiation, and that understanding requires both patience and courage. Even silence became a teacher, a reminder that ethical presence is not only about action but also about thoughtful restraint. School was equally instructive. I observed my peers navigating their own identities, some clumsily, some gracefully, and I reflected on my own early missteps. I began small experiments in public expression, choosing subtle cues that resonated with my identity without demanding attention. These acts were neither performative nor impulsive, they were exercises in deliberate courage and ethical mindfulness. I learned that being seen is not inherently liberating, it is an opportunity to practice empathy, accountability, and reflective awareness. And yet, doubt remained. There were moments of near panic, moments when I questioned the worth of exposure, the risk of misjudgment, the possibility of misunderstanding. But those moments were different now, they were not paralyzing. They were data, signals to be interpreted, compass points guiding reflection and measured action. Fear became a teacher rather than a jailer, shaping my decisions without dominating them. Courage, I realized, is not the absence of fear, it is the disciplined, reflective engagement with it. Over time, my internal dialogue deepened. I journaled, wrote letters never sent, rehearsed conversations, and reflected on every ripple of consequence. I became acutely aware of the moral weight embedded in even small acts of self-expression. I understood that identity is inseparable from ethics, that to inhabit oneself fully requires attentiveness not only to personal desire but also to the emotional and social landscapes we navigate. One late afternoon, Lena visited again. We spoke at length, not about clothing or appearance, but about responsibility, courage, and the ongoing process of becoming. Transformation, she said quietly, isn't about spectacle or surprise. It's about awareness, of self, of others, and of the impact we leave behind. The real work begins after the moment of revelation, in the days, months, and years that follow. Her words resonated deeply. I realized that all I had experienced, the initial shock, the hidden experiments, the incremental public gestures, the ongoing reflection, was preparation for a life lived with deliberate awareness. Identity, courage, and ethical engagement are not momentary, they are continuous, evolving, and relational. Being oneself responsibly is an act of moral attention, a constant negotiation, a practice in empathy as much as self-expression. That evening, I stood once again before the mirror. The reflection that met me was both familiar and profoundly altered. It bore the imprint of months of reflection, ethical consideration, and deliberate practice. I saw a person who had learned to inhabit complexity without surrendering to fear, to navigate social realities without abandoning authenticity, to integrate internal desire with external responsibility. I recognized in that reflection a form of courage that was quiet but unwavering, deliberate but resilient, a courage rooted in insight, empathy, and moral awareness. I thought of Lena, of my sister, of the countless unseen observers in daily life. I understood that transformation is never purely private, nor is it entirely public. It is relational, continuous, and deeply ethical. It requires reflection, vigilance, and courage in the face of uncertainty. It asks us to consider consequences without silencing truth, to navigate fear without abandoning hope, to balance vulnerability with accountability. And in that realization, I felt a profound sense of alignment. I was no longer simply experimenting in private or testing boundaries in secret. I had begun to inhabit my own life fully, with awareness of self, others, and consequence. The act of being seen had shifted from threat to dialogue. The act of being understood had become an ongoing practice, a commitment to integrity and reflection. I exhaled slowly, feeling the quiet satisfaction that comes not from triumph or spectacle, but from careful, sustained growth. Transformation is never complete, but in that moment, I recognized the depth of what had been achieved, a mind attuned to reflection, a body inhabited with intentionality, a self expressed with ethical courage, and a heart capable of empathy and understanding. And I understood, finally, that the journey would continue, in small acts and subtle choices, in every interaction, every glance, every decision. Identity is not a destination, it is a living, breathing process. And in embracing that process with care, thoughtfulness, and moral attention, I had begun to inhabit a life that was authentically, responsibly, and deeply my own.